everybody hear me okay in the back? Sometimes I'm told my voice doesn't project, so I'm going to try. I really wanted that microphone, but apparently it doesn't work today. Thanks for coming out. I know it's the last session of the day. I'm going to try and keep it light, hopefully a little bit short. And if there's one takeaway from today, I think I just want to hopefully inspire some people in here to just download the project and start playing with it a little bit. Try and make the case that it's a fun thing to do. So some context. I work for a digital curriculum company, ICEV. That's not that important. The important thing to know is that we present lessons to students at the high school CTE level. And we have a handful, not a whole lot, but trying to build more small games that are sort of a reinforcement exercise to help students kind of break up the boredom of PowerPoint slideshow style presentation and reinforce some ideas. However, over the years, those have been sourced from a lot of different places, sometimes internal teams just playing around with stuff on the weekend, sometimes purchased from a company that just made a prefab white box product and pulled it in, to projects that were contracted out where this internal team like with real focus. But there's sort of at varying different states of maintenance over the years. And everything gets old, you gotta refresh it once in a while. Here's a couple on the screen here of a couple games that we recently converted over. The one on the left is supposed to look kind of like Jeopardy. And the one on the right, which is where I'll show you some of the code samples later in the talk, is our keyboarding game. That's the old version. I used to work for a company called AES. We were recently acquired by ICEV, and we had the task of moving all of our content onto a new platform, which means that things that were dependent on the old platform were broken. And so we need to rewrite some of the client-server code for student progress and scoring related to this. And I didn't really want to rewrite it in the code base that already exists. We already knew we needed to refresh it. I thought now's a good time for us to start over from scratch. And so enters Defold. What is it? It's a game engine, first and foremost. They say 2D focused, 3D capable. I really was attracted to this for the 2D capabilities, but 3D is kind of like a newer focus. It's always been rendered in OpenGL type libraries. Always had the capability of rendering in 3D because it was actually rendered in a 3D engine, just using 2D things. So now they're trying to put some focus on like, oh, okay, let's pull some 3D stuff. However, I wouldn't say if you're making a 3D game from scratch today, it might not be the best platform. You might look at something like Unity for that. But if I'm doing simple 2D games, great fit. It's scripted using Lua code. It comes with a dedicated IDE. Everything's in one package, and it is source available asterisk. Basically, that means it is effectively open source. They did create their own license. I have to talk about this in the next slide, but I'll just finish what I'm saying here. It's based on the Apache license. It's very permissive, but the one thing that they wanted to make sure was that nobody monetized the platform itself. So you can make games and sell them. That's the intent of it, but you can't make a derivative of the default game engine and IDE and sell that. You can make one and give it away for free, but you can't sell it. So that's why they say source available. They don't use the term open source because their license is slightly more restrictive. Anyway, brief history from somebody who wasn't there, so I'm not an expert on any of this, but it was created by Christian Murray and Ragnar Svensson as a side project while they were working for, should have written it down, I think it's Ascent Games, people that made Just Cause. Anyway. In 2014, it was acquired by King. You may or may not recognize that name, but they're the people that had everybody addicted to the Bejeweled franchise. And then in 2016, they decided to release the IDE and engine for free use. And then just recently, in 2020, in the midst of all the chaos, they decided this was going to go open source. King donated the Defold engine and some seed money to form Defold Foundation. They are on the board, but they do not own Defold Foundation. It's now a fully separate entity, and other gaming companies are also involved in the board, and they're mainly supported by donations and commercial support from gaming companies that are using the engine. Yep. Why it's cool. I couldn't think of a picture, so I think that's what a cool person must look like. I was never as cool as that kid, but it's truly cross-platform. You can write your game once and compile it for web, Switch, Windows, Apple, Linux, Steam, Facebook games, if anybody still does that. There's a handful of others. If you happen to have a PlayStation developer license, you can get a version of Defold that is licensed for that. They're not allowed to distribute that one unless you have a PlayStation developer license. But if you got it, you can build the thing on the same platform, and they just have to have a different version of the executable. It is not yet working for Xbox as far as I know, unless the new release has that. They're still working with Microsoft on licensing for that. They want to be able to publish to Xbox, but we're not there yet. Zero setup. This is pretty cool. I don't know when the last time most people have experienced this, but you download the executable, you run it. There's no dependencies. If you have Mac, Windows, a semi-recent Linux install, you can download the executable, you can launch the IDE, you can build a game and compile a game for any of the platforms. You don't need to set up your iOS separate from your Android, separate from your web. It all just builds.
Does it bring its own Java runtime, or do you have to have Java?
You do not have to have it on your machine for it to compile. There's some amount of cloud compiling here. I don't know the exact details of this, but there's a cloud service that they can build for all the platforms, and that's a way that they get, you don't have to do all the setup locally to get it running.
They did mention that cloud building component is something you can choose to self-host instead.
That is true, yes.
But I think you have to choose some remote build thing.
Right. If you're wary about that, you can download that project and get that all set up and do it on-prem yourself if you're wary about it.
Which would be just more than zero setup.
Yeah, that would be more than zero setup. Yeah. But if you just want to play with the thing and you're not too worried about, like, do I trust these Defold people with the cloud or not, you can get up and running quick. And so the one thing that I want to emphasize for this is I'm not a game developer. I make web apps. I wanted to make some games, and I was able to get up and running really quick. You can further optimize these things if you want to get deep under the hood. You can, but the startup, energy to get from zero to building is practically non-existent. Small and performant. It's fast. One of the things, a lot of our users, I want to say close to half of our users are students that are stuck with Chromebooks. They can't handle a heavy game engine chugging away on their Chromebooks. I am also our product is delivered primarily as a web application. So I'm building for HTML5. It gets compiled to WebAssembly. It's very efficient and relatively small packages. The engine itself, when it's compiled, is less than a megabyte. It's roughly a third of the engine size of a Unity or a Godot. And that matters when you have, bad bandwidth, as a lot of our schools have low bandwidth, and not very performant machines. It helps to be less than a megabyte. And their kind of core philosophy is that they want to provide simple building blocks to make your game. So they're not targeting every feature or every hottest new thing. It's not going to look like Unreal Engine, but it's going to be simple to build and run. And there's less that you have to sort of hold in your head of how does the engine behave? How do I, what functions do I use? The simplicity of the code has value in itself because you can reason about the code just by looking at it. And that's something that, as this is not my primary development, it helps to not be having to hold that game engine knowledge in my head as I'm working on this, or work on it for a while, put it aside for 6 months to a year to 3 years, and pick it up later and try and figure out what I was doing. It helps to not have a whole bunch of stuff all over the place. It's complicated. So anyway, they use the building blocks analogy. This is kind of the building blocks that Defold gives you. They give you game objects, which represent sort of everything that happens in what you could call the physical world of the game. Collections, which are a way of grouping game objects and other components together, and factories, where the idea of I've defined what an object is, and now I need to be able to spawn some. That's what a factory is for. There's GUIs, which are similar to game objects, except that they don't interact with anything in the quote-unquote physical space of the game. They just sit on top, and there's a little bit of extra, or not extra, but slightly different scripting interaction that's kind of focused on the GUI itself. I mostly wanted to handle button clicks and rendering things that don't interact with the physical space, that kind of stuff, slightly separated out from game objects. Everything, like I said, is scripted in Lua. I don't know why I capitalized all 3 letters there, but and both game objects and GUIs have the same exact template script for both. They all have the same life cycle, and I'll get into that a little bit. The idea of the message queue, I split this out separately. This is really a performance thing, but it also helps reduce the amount of stuff that I need to reason about when I'm working on my game. There's one message queue, and we'll get into the details of that later. I'm getting too long on this slide. There's a sprite animation engine. I'll get into why that's cool. There's a built-in particle effect toolkit, and there's physics engine. They use Box2D and Bullet physics engines. They're bundled together. You can also extend these core building blocks if you need to add some behaviors that are not built in. You can go down to C code or OS level operations and wrap them up in a way that can be used in the game engine. But they give you a lot out of the box to just start building. I'm going to start talking about game objects. I kind of started ranting about that a little bit, but this is, there is some GUI on this screen. I probably shouldn't have shown that, but you can see this is the IDE, the gist of it. By the way, I'm going to get into some code examples after the fact. I just want to give like an overview of things, and then we'll go to code examples. So I'm going to try and move along a little quicker because I'm going a little slow here. So game objects would be kind of the physical space, like I said. So in this case, I've got a collection. It's got a game object in it. They can be nested. The game object has a background, has a player, which is another game object. Get into that. It's got some sounds. It's got a factory for generating enemies. And there's a library that I'm using here as a screen manager. We're not going to go into the details on that. One thing to know about that is that there are community libraries that are collected and published by Defold. Things that people have found themselves doing a lot in their own game development and decide to share some things. Monarch is one of them. It's a screen manager. It helps with some navigation type stuff. But I am going to skim over that later. GUIs, slightly different from game objects, but similar structure. GUIs have a collection of nodes. Nodes can be either a box or text. They can have textures applied to them, and they have a way of interacting with them to update values on them or handle interactions that's slightly different from game objects because they sit on top of everything. They don't interact with the physical world of your game. And then here's an example of the Lua script. You probably can't read it too well. Unfortunately, this is a lower resolution screen than I was hoping for, but they all have the same life cycle, whether it's a GUI or a game object or a script that you're using for anything else in your game. I'm going to get into some of the things that you do here later, but they all have an init method that's fired as soon as the object is instantiated. They have a final method that's fired right before it gets deleted, pretty straightforward. There's an update method, gets fired every time a frame is rendered. Cool thing about that is it gives you delta time, which means if your game is running at a different frame rate on a different piece of hardware, you can use that delta time to get fixed performance. If you're rendering 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, you can still make it behave effectively the same in time by using that value. Fixed update is similar to update. We won't get into details on that. That's an option that you can use. Basically, to turn on fixed frame rates. I only want to render 60 frames per second. I want it to be very consistent. The engine will enforce it for me. Then there's onMessage. That handles the messaging queue. I'll talk about the messaging queue a little bit different. On input handles user inputs, clicks, keys, and also physics inputs, collisions, those types of things. And then on reload, I have never used, but in the event that you wanted to do something that's separate from the init and the final, when the object gets reloaded, you can put it there. Messaging queue. I wanted to split this out separately because I think it's pretty cool. There is one message queue. Every object, every UI element in the game gets an ID, address, and there's one message queue. You want to send something to anything in the game, all you need to know is its ID, and you can send it to that ID. The messaging queue handles the delivery. You don't need to worry about where it is in memory. You don't need to worry about if it's a child or something else. You just got to know its ID, you send it a message, and it will receive it. Not only that, it will receive the ID of the object that sent the message to it. So in this way, we can handle communication between objects. The example I have here is a collision response. So this is sort of given to me by the physics engine when two objects collide. In this case, it's a laser hit mine. I don't remember if this was an enemy or myself, but in this example, but I got the laser hit. I know the ID of the other, and I can send a message to them. just with message.post. I got the ID from the received message. And then so this is an enemy because I went and deleted myself after I got hit. So there you go. Actually, I think this is later. Okay, we'll get to it. There's built-in sprite and animation engine. There's basically two different ways that you can handle collections of art in Defold. You can either use what they call an atlas, which is sort of like a self-generating sprite sheet. It's pretty cool. Or if everything has exactly the same dimensions and all your tiles, you can use a tile source, which is what you see on the left there. So the right is an atlas, the left is a tile source. I'll show kind of how both of those work. There's particle effects. There's what I used this for was an explosion. Like, I don't really want to have to manually draw every detail of an explosion. And also I like some randomization so it looks a little different every time one happens. I can just throw a collection of sprites together into the particle engine, tweak some settings, remix it, and it'll generate unique random explosions for me. I do want to demo that. Physics engine, different geometries you can throw for collision at any given game object, and I'll show some of the details of that. I'm going to jump to the editor to try and show some of these things, how they're actually used. Before I do that, does anybody have any questions so far? All right, we'll jump into it. And then I have this final slide. I haven't figured out how to make the transition from editor to slide well, but I'll just put this right here. I want to give some attribution to Kenny. Kenny makes free game map assets, and they're like pretty good to look at, and they're completely free, and the license is extremely permissive. You can use them however you want. So, two big links here: defold.com for the Defold game engine, kenny.nl for Kenny's game assets. Let's see some of them in here. Now I'm going to go into the editor. All right, so example script. I kind of talked through this already, and I probably shouldn't have. You can read it a little better on here. Does anybody feel like I need to go over the game script again? No? We'll skip that part. Let's talk about a game object. So I'm going to do a collection. I'm going to do my enemy collection. Let's see. Yeah, I apologize. I hit most of what I wanted to say about this while we were just looking at slides. But we'll just zoom in here on my enemy here is a collection of things. One thing that it is a sprite, which is just this piece of artwork here that gives me something to look at. And another thing that it is collision objects that give my physics engine something to interact with. And then there's some sound effects that it can use. And you can't see it here, but you'll see it when I show the game. There's a label object that tells me what word corresponds to the enemy. And then there's my explosion, which is a particle effect. We'll get into that. These collections and game objects can be nested kind of infinitely deep. But if you want to use a factory to spawn things, you need to put them in a collection, not just a game object. We'll talk about the GUI briefly. GUI is very similar to a game object. In this case, I'll get into the game GUI. The game GUI is effectively just laying out on the screen all my nodes that represent some boxes. Boxes can be shaded, they can be textured, and some text nodes that will give me things that I can manipulate: scores, timers, that kind of stuff. Down here in the left here is where I'm going to render out my words that are typed from the typing room. And yeah, not too much to say about that. There's just different ways to interact with a GUI versus with a game object for the sake of updates. But all that to say, the scripts look the same. So jump into my game GUI script. This is the bulk of what actually controls the game logic for this particular game is just in the script for this screen. Again, it's all Lua code. It's pretty, the nice thing about Lua is that it doesn't have a lot of features. And that maybe doesn't sound like a nice thing, but it comes back to that whole thing about how much knowledge do I have to hold in my head to be able to work on this project. Less features means less things to remember how to work with the thing. So for example, it doesn't have a switch syntax. You just do if else. Now that's a simple example because I think most people can remember how to use switches, but it's just an example of where Lua kind of strips it down to sort of the minimum of what you need to get the job done. And so I think that's part of what makes it really nice for game scripting is that it's hard to introduce complexity that you can't see. You know, it's hard to hide complexity. So in the init here, just talk about the GUI real quick a little bit too while we're in here. You can see I'm doing some GUI get nodes. I'm assigning them to some variables. The variables are all locals. If you're familiar with Lua, or if you're not familiar with Lua, there's only 3 data types. There's numbers, there's strings, and there's tables. And if you want to make it do cool stuff, you can enhance tables to have functions on them and things. But there's no array. An array is just a table with numeric keys. It's, like I said, really stripped down. I want to talk about the message queue. I kind of already did. But coming back to the example again, on message, in this case, I have my game script is receiving some messages. So I have other screens, like an ending screen. I might want to restart the game. I can send it a message called reunit. These are all hashed because when this gets compiled down, we want to have like the smallest unique message IDs that we can. So we're not doing string comparison, but we can recreate the ID by using this hash function. So that's what that's about. Let's see. When the timer's up, I go ahead and I receive from my timer the stop message. And then I go ahead and send from here, I can send some messages to go ahead and like do a last update on my GUI. I did mention the updates in here is not very interesting. I'm going to do an update in. We're jumping into animation when you're here now. I want to jump into an enemy here real quick. So here's my update method on an enemy. So every time a frame is rendered, every game object will receive a call to the update method again, and it will give you the delta time between when that frame was rendered in the previous frame. So you can sort of gauge how fast things are running. In this case, I am keeping track of a certain amount of time in seconds that I want to have between when the enemy starts firing at the player and not. So I go ahead and I do some basic subtraction against the attack time. If it's still got time remaining, and if it doesn't, I'm going to post to myself, this is a shorthand, a little dot notation, post to myself the message, fire the laser. And then I'm giving it a new attack time with a little bit of math, fuzzing it out so it's not too consistent all the time. In my on message here, I'm going to receive fire laser. I'm going to get my position. I'm going to create a laser at my position. I'm going to play a sound. Pretty straightforward. Getting into animation a little bit. I've got a couple methods in here that I call, so that jumping back to the update, every frame I'm going to look at player. Why do I do that? Because the player's moving. I just want my enemies to always be looking at the player. So something I can do, I created a function here that can get the game object. So there's a couple of helper methods for the world. I can do get position, and I'm giving it the path to my player object, and then I can get my own position. If I give it no argument, it gives my own position. And then I do a quick, hopefully everybody was in the remedial math section today, so I don't need to explain what an arctangent is. Do a quick arctangent to get the angle of the enemy, and then once I have the angle, I can just call the game object set rotation. It's just translating the angle to a vector that the game engine wants. And I'm setting the rotation when I play the game, which we will do quickly. I label all the enemies with the words that they correspond to. So I need to set the rotation of both the enemy, and that's what's happening in the second section. And I need to set the rotation of the label, because as the enemy turns, because the label is a child of the enemy, naturally it's going to want to turn with the enemy, but I would like it to be right side up all the time. So I'm counter rotating to keep it always right side up, which is cool because it's just the inverse of the angle. I just do minus angle, it always stays right side up. I want to talk about the laser real quick, and then I'm going to jump back, because this is an example of one style of movement. If you look at the tutorials for Defold, some of the older tutorials will only talk about this style of movement. There's another style of movement that I'll jump back to. So this is a laser. It's its own game object. And all it does is it moves in a direction, right? So when it's initialized, I am going to give it a rotation, or actually I'm going to give it a target. One thing in here that I didn't mention before is the idea of properties. So a property is sort of like a special version of a variable that's exposed publicly. And one of the things that lets you do is when you initialize a new object, which I'll do in the factory, and we'll probably skip over the factory, but you can pass properties to it, or when you're just building stuff out in the GUI, you can set properties right here. So the fact that I created a property here called target, I have it defaulted to player because this is the only thing that I target in this game, but if I wanted to use this kind of object, well actually, that's wrong. I use the same script for the player's lasers as the enemy's lasers. So in this case, the default is to target the player, but if the player created the laser, I tell it what the target is. But also you can set it here in the GUI if it's defined as a property instead of a regular variable. Anyway, animation of the laser, it moves in a straight line, and I need it to move at a set speed, so I can tweak around with this, but this is set to 1500 pixels per second. Just keeping track of the number. I get my update, I get my position, I get my rotation. My movement is forward, which is just this vector up here, which is just saying I'm moving in the direction of Y, and no other direction. That's what 0, 1, 0, X, Y, Z. And then I'm rotating it by my current rotation, which is coming from my game object. It can just tell me that. And then I move it forward based on my speed times the delta time. So that means it moves at the same rate, even if there's a little bit of a stutter in the frame rendering, it'll continue moving at the same rate because I have that delta. And then I just set my position, which just moves to that new position. There's another way to do this, which is easier, which is animation. They have easings. It's very similar if you're familiar with CSS animations. And I use that in my enemy script. Every once in a while, I want to change where my enemy is sitting. Rather than doing all of the in-between calculations of how to move from point A to point B, I can just decide where I want to move to. So I'm setting a destination using vector 3. I can go ahead and animate that with this game object.animate. I give it what type of animation I want. So this was not looping, it wants forward. I give it the destination, and I give it the easing function that I want to use and how long I want it to run for, and it just runs that animation. And then there's a callback at the end, which is my drift at location function. That fires when the animation is finished. So I have my enemies kind of jitter around a little bit when they're being still, just so they don't look completely static. Let's see. We're getting a little tight for time, and I don't want to keep you all forever. I do want to show off a little bit about the animation for the sprite editor. So I mentioned tile maps, tile source. So this is basically I imported a PNG file. I tell it how big my tiles are. It slices it all up into tiles. I can then make a map from that. Here's my tile map. It'll actually open the thing. There it is. So I just press space, it gives me my tile source that I have. And I can pick my palette, and I can start drawing. Just drawing my map out. I can add another layer. And I can go ahead and put some trees on top of that. It matters what order the layers are. Layer 1, yeah, go this backwards. Anyway, I'm going to run short on time. I don't want to spend too much time here. I didn't use this on my game. What's up, Craig? Yeah, gotcha.
Can you create your own properties on the tile map?
Say again?
Like a property
yeah.
map, can you create your own properties there?
Yes. So the Z index can be used. There's 2 properties: ID Z index and visible. 3 properties: ID Z index and visible. So there you go. Order doesn't matter. It just matters what Z index you put on it. Yeah, I want to show the particle effects because they are very cool. So, well, actually, before we do that, let's do the atlas. This was pretty cool. I showed this to somebody that did some flash animation, and like the simple things. It kind of blew his mind. Basically, you don't need to create your own sprite sheets. You can have a collection of PNG files, and if you want to add them in, you just add images like this one. And it'll append them onto the atlas which then when it compiles goes and creates a single PNG sprite sheet out of it. And then you can also like preview, you can put animations and static images together. So in this case, I have a shield animation that I added here and an explosion animation. You can preview them right in line as well. So this is my little explosion running there. So that little explosion is kind of cool, but it's not that exciting, and that's where the particle effects come in. So create some particle effects that contain my explosion. Okay, we're zoomed in way too far. There we are. Contain my explosion, and I also added, you know, a couple of emitters of other particles. So each of these here is an emitter. I can add another one. You can pick circle, sphere, different shapes. Cone is a common one. By default, this is going to use the built-in like spark. I'm going to just go ahead and delete that one, but just so you can see. And then you can, once the emitters are created, you can just start tweaking around. So each of these is mapped to a different PNG file from my atlas. You can just start tweaking around. I want more sparks. So I can say, okay, I'm going to say my max particle count is 400. And I'm going to say my spawn rate is also 400. And wow, now all of a sudden my explosion is a lot more populated, and I didn't really have to redraw anything myself. And then there's also what's these called? Modifiers. So these are modifiers are like physics modifiers. So I like this vortex one. I applied kind of a subtle one just to get a little twistiness to it. But if you really wanted it to be extreme, you know, you can do just with a little bit of tweaking, you get a completely different effect. I'm just trying to go back, like, none. I apologize, I talk slower than
I have a question.
Yeah.
The messages, can you send like you make a multiplayer game on 2 pulse racing?
So if you want to do multiplayer over network, there are multiple add-in libraries that you can choose for that. The Defold engine itself doesn't have an opinion on that, but they have a lot of different options that you can plug into. Or if none of them work for you, there's an HTTP library built in, and you can use that however you want to. So, and then if that's still too slow or whatever, you can go to the lower level and start. There's also WebSockets. If you want to do a quick demo of how fast this thing builds, just to prove the point. From there, that's how long it took to build my game. And again, I didn't have to set up any libraries for this to work. I literally download the executable, you work on your game, Command D, you got a game. So, my explosions are a lot more interesting than they were the last time. Very cool. Cool. So, yeah, if anybody else, this is the last session of the day, so if you want to hang out and chat, I will hang out here. There is some like closing remarks. I think.
Yeah, according to the schedule, 4:50 to 5:20, this room is used for desserts and debriefs. I have no idea what that means, but in the Steinman Hall, there's going to be a session of lightning talks, so presentations that are only about 5 minutes at a time, and following that in Steinman Hall will be the farewell and closing ceremonies. If you would like to hang out even more beyond that, I have been told that there is an after party. You were here this morning, we heard details about that. It's going to be over at Pub Forge, which is in the same building as TELUS So if you're familiar with TELUS 360, come hang out with us there. I think I plan to be going. Mr. Joel Walker has offered me the opportunity to play some retro video games on the projector, so we might be doing some of that too. And
Where's the entrance to Pub Forge?
entrance to Pub Forge, I'm glad you asked. That is really on the side of the building. Does that little alleyway as it heads up into the garage have a name? I'm sure it does.
It's a ramp.
So if you're facing the entrance to TELUS 360, you kind of just want to make a right turn and go around the corner, and you'll see the sign for Pub Forge as you head up the alleyway. It sounds a little skeevy, but it's easier than trying to make your way through TELUS a lot of the time.
Oh, there we go.
Thanks, Jake.
Try to go through
Except
Palace
it's
and
punching
then
in
charge
the
the credit
front.
card.
There you go.
This ramp right here.
This ramp right
All
here.
right, you go up this ramp all the way to the back. Almost get up there. Just don't go to the dumpsters. Go up the ramp.
So some of you will see there. Thanks, everybody.